I've finished reading the next two books in my sort of surrealist reading TBR, and I think these two books were probably the most surrealist of them all, that I think I was expecting them to be in that way. At least for me, they feel like they're the two that most fit into the traditional concept of what surrealism is, at like perhaps its beginning stages, and kind of show the most how we've gone from what surrealism once was to sort of the concept that we now have of magical realism, speculative fiction, and like contemporary surrealist, sort of new weird genre that you find China medieval writing in. So the two books that I've read were Mood Indigo by Boris Vian and Nadja by André Breton. These books are both translated from the French, and I think they both capture that sort of Parisian feeling of surrealism and being within that sort of society and that mindset of this movement coming to life and growing and evolving and becoming more popular, and the way that surrealism moved into literature and sort of the relationship between these thinkers and these writers and how they've kind of shaped contemporary literature in some ways how it is today. So the first book that I want to talk about is Mood Indigo by Boris Vian. This book follows a man who falls in love with a woman, and the woman becomes sick, and within her lung there is a water lily that's growing, and in order to keep her healthy and to perhaps try and prevent this water lily from growing too strong and kind of killing her, she must be surrounded by flowers at all times, no matter the cost. And it's that whole concept of what do you sacrifice for love and everything. This book is really, really quite playful. There are lines in it, there are words in it that it shows just how much Vian is playing with what words can do and what words can be. I really found it quite fun to think the concept behind this book, because it's set in what feels like a very contemporary time, but there's also lots of like really fantastical elements where, like, for example, there's a cocktail maker that's combined with a piano, so whatever tune you play on the piano, it creates a cocktail to match that sound, and it's like a perfect match all the time. And there's things like this, there's things that happen in this world, and well, even the fact that the woman has a water lily growing in her lung, these things just seem completely like nonsense things, but that work so well in the book because of the way the book is set up, the way the language is utilised to express these sort of nonsensical happenings, but also just because of the way it just feels so very real in the context of this story. I did enjoy it. There were times when I kind of felt like I wasn't too ready to completely pick up on every single playful moment, or there were times where I felt personally like, oh, I don't really want to have to read something that is so playful. So I think this could have been a 5-star read had I read it at a different time, but because I was just a bit like in a different mindset perhaps, I gave it only 4 stars. I would definitely recommend it though, because it is just a really fun piece of literature, and I think it can be read as really quite literary, and perhaps to some it might be a little bit intimidating, but I think it can also be read just as a little bit of fun. At times where the writing was so playful, it almost detracted a little bit from the emotion of the story, and that I couldn't really wholly invest in the emotional connection and the emotional impact that the story kind of like led to, because I was kind of too busy having a bit of fun, or too busy noticing all like the quirks in the writing. There are just some really interesting elements, and I think that this kind of speaks to lots of other things and lots of silly ways that we behave as people and some of the silly things that we do. The characters have their own sort of logic, and they work to that logic, but it's a logic that is different to ours, and that's where it becomes a little bit more surreal, is that things that they do or things that they say and the things that happen in this text juxtapose expectations, and it kind of squashes what you imagine people should be doing. But also the fantastical elements, I guess, are in themselves a bit surreal, in the fact that there are usually two very mundane objects that have been put together to create a really unique, quirky new object that has a completely different meaning, but still holds the meaning of the two mundane objects beforehand, if that makes sense. But that's quite a surrealist move, and even though that Vian isn't particularly part of the surrealist movement, and he was part of the Ulipa group of writers who used rules and structures to play, which you could definitely see in the construction of the sentences, like the words. He'll sometimes mix common phrases and either change words around or change letters to create new words, which completely upsets the original meaning of the phrase but gives it a whole new meaning, and things like that are completely wonderful and very, I found it to be very witty also. So I definitely would recommend this to a lot more people perhaps than I would Nadja, but again, I just wish that I had probably been in a better mindset so I could have truly like luxuriated in the world and the storytelling that was used here. Nadja, on the other hand, this book was definitely not what I was expecting, and it's a very clever book, but I gave it 3 stars, mostly because I wasn't quite sure what I actually think of it. I couldn't tell whether I thought André Breton was really clever and quite intelligent in what he was doing, or he was just an arrogant swine who thought he was better than everybody else. It kind of borders that whole very fine edge of being either pretentious or being quite new and exciting, and I just didn't know where I fell on this sort of like these sort of like binaries. So I think 3 stars is the perfect rating for this book, because it wasn't quite genius like a 5-star, but it wasn't quite pretentious arseholery like a 1-star. It was a 3-star where I'm kind of tied between the two, and there are moments that I wanted to celebrate his genius, but there are always moments where I wanted to stick up my middle finger and tell him to bugger off. But this book follows André Breton, who is our narrator, also talking about a relationship with a woman called Nadja, and that's literally all it is. And what's surreal about this text, because there isn't much, I don't think there's much sort of surrealism in how we would expect surrealism to manifest, especially in contrast to Mood Indigo, where it was very much really quirky, a little bit fantastical, lots of odd things happening. It was surrealist in its manner of being so mundane and so everyday, and like it is literally a recount or André Breton's interactions with this woman, and it is just, that's kind of what makes it surreal, is that it is just so everyday, but the characters, their thoughts are not so everyday, and their thoughts are almost bordering this edge of insanity. And in fact, Nadja perhaps could be quite easily declared as insane. But the focus of this book is not so much on the story itself, but in the way it's written. And I think the first 60 pages of this book, André Breton talks about the role of writers and writers who write stories that are basically their lives but are fictionalized, and how we have this sort of notion of, do we applaud a writer when they are writing so close to their own experiences in fiction, and how does that blur the lines between fiction and memoir, biography, of everything else? Or should we disparage that act, and should writers write complete fabrications and complete fictions? So this whole discussion happens for 60 pages. It reads very quickly, this book. It's 160 pages, and there are lots of pictures in it too, so actually you can get through this very quickly, probably in one sitting. And then the rest of the story basically makes you doubt whether this is based on a real experience that Breton had, or whether it is completely fictionalized. So it kind of crosses this line of it being so mundane and so real that you could almost think of it as a very real historic document of André Breton meeting a woman. But on the other hand, it has these moments that don't feel quite real, that feel too easy to be a real sort of structured story. And André Breton talks about the way that we tell stories, the way that we create narratives in a chronological order that doesn't actually make sense to real life, because real life doesn't happen chronologically. Real life happens by us piecing together bits in our past to creating a chronology. So that plays a part in this, and how coincidences create chronology, and those coincidences, in their utter coincidental nature, juxtapose what reality feels like when we feel like reality isn't a story of coincidences. It is a line of fate, perhaps, or something like that. So it talks about that and it covers that. So the story itself is playing with this idea, but it's doing it in a way that's kind of unsettling and getting under your skin, because you're just doubting all the time what's real, what's fiction, and that is the sort of surrealist nature of this text. It is that playfulness with chronology, time, temporality, fiction and reality, to create a feeling where you're not quite sure what's what. Now, because both of them play with this kind of mode of love, I find that interesting as a concept for surrealists to look at, because I think love is like almost overdone. It's present in so much fiction, it's present in so much storytelling, it's like ever present in our lives. You know, we feel different kinds of love, and I think these books do give you different notions of what love is. And I think what's interesting for surrealists when looking at the kind of the modal telling of love is that it gives you so much to play with, and it gives them so much to play with. And I think by writing two romance novels in a way that isn't romantic in the slightest, really gives it that surrealist element, and really gives it that playful pushing the boundaries of what romance could be and what romance would look like. And I think it represents more about the reality of love, and how in the real world it's not actually as larger than life as it is depicted through a lot of literature, when it is very much romanticized, and it is, you know, gives us this impression of what love should be like. It plays more on that concept of what is love really like, and that it is just a false chronology of coincidences that create these feelings and a story in our heads, that we then currently enact and sort of fabricate ourselves, but that are no less real than the reality. If that makes sense. This is getting into really sort of perhaps odd existentialist concepts here, which I think is definitely what the surrealists are playing with. They're playing with the concept of existentialism. They're playing with these French pre-war notions of art and literature, and then between the wars, it kind of, as they grow and develop, the writers are definitely utilizing them in a way that is playful and pushes the boundaries and represents what was happening in philosophy within literature also. So yeah, interesting thoughts. Probably not the most coherent of thoughts, but they exist nonetheless. So those are those two books out of the way. I've got two more to read, and hopefully I'll be reviewing them for you soon. So I'll see you next time for another video. Bye bye.